Anyway, nice to be here. When I ran into Enid last summer, she asked me if I would like to speak about the Royal Oak area, and I said that I didn't know very much about Royal Oak, but I knew a little bit about Killaloe Bay because I'd lived there for 3 years, and so I've stretched my imagination and tried to think of all the things I could think of, and all the people who were characters and who I knew at Killaloe Bay as a kid from 14 to 17 years old. And but first I'd like to introduce Wayne Rowley over here. I went to Royal Oak in grade 9, Vic High in grade 10, and St. Louis College in grade 11 and 12. And Wayne was one of my best friends from St. Louis College. He lives in Broadmead, so perhaps he's a future member, if you twist his arm. Anyway, as I say, I came to Killaloe Bay when I was 14, 1952, and my mother and father had just bought the Killaloe Bay store. And my dad was wanting to start a plastering contracting business, and my mother thought she could run a general store because she had done before in Sheffield in England. And my father had also been a general contractor in England. So they wanted to give it a shot. My dad would run the store, Dad would run the plastering business, and Mum would run the store. So anyway, we moved in, and you all know that the Frenches used to own the Killaloe Bay store. They were very popular people. They had 3 beautiful daughters. And one of the first people who came around the store was Stan Kello. Stan Kello knew more about the store than we did. He showed us around because he was sweet on Irene French. And shortly, I hadn't been there very long, Stan said, hop on the back of the bike and I'll take you for a ride. So we went roaring down Saywood Road there around that 90-degree bend at about 80 miles an hour, and that was that scared me for life for a motorbike. We had, it was a general store. We sold coal oil and rabbit food and nails and stationery. Fred Sutton was the Collison paper representative. He'd come in once a week and top up the stationery. We sold fresh vegetables. Choi Wong was the Chinese man. He used to have a 3-quarter Dodge truck, and he'd come around once a week and keep the vegetables fresh. We had fresh meat from Harvey's down in Victoria, and every Friday night at 5 o'clock, I would go down to Norton's Bakery, and I'd pick up an order of bakery goods. And there was always 24 cream horns in that order, and by the time the store closed at 7 o'clock at night, those cream horns were gone. And by Saturday night, when the store had closed, all the bakery goods were gone. We had a lady called Bessie Brown, and her picture is up there, who was my mother's right-hand lady. And she and my mother got along very well. And there was another lady called Tipper McDermott, somebody up there. And she was also one of my mother's assistants. And they all got along very well. I think Tipper lived in the McMorran's auto court by that, where the basketball court used to be. Now, as far as, there's one other thing about Norton's. Norton's Bakery, where we got the bakery goods from, we used to be on the corner of Fort and Cook, and the lady that ran it was Mrs. Henderson, and she had a brother who worked for the Yukon White Pass Railway, and he agreed to try and get me a job on the riverboats running up and down the Yukon. So that was a very encouraging, something that I was looking forward to. So now, that's pretty well all the people involved with the store. some of our customers. Now, we had some very interesting customers, and my dad got along famously with some of them. One of them was, the first one I had mentioned was probably a very colorful fellow, was Thorne Forrest, BC Land Surveyor. Now, Thorne used to come into the store and tell my dad these wild stories about up in the north. And, of course, I'd be in the back kind of listening with my ear open. Thorne was a guy that was in the First World War right from the beginning. He put in 17 months with a machine gun, Canadian Scottish with a machine gun corps. He eventually was commissioned in the Imperial Machine Gun Corps. And he came back from that drudgery and started working with some of the better BC land surveyor firms in Victoria. There were some very good ones in the old days. And he got his commission about 1934. And Thorne was an independent guy, and he had his office in the backyard at the other end of Cordova Bay Road. And he got into the mining business, and one of the things that he was known for was one of the major stakers of the Cassiar mine. And Cassiar mine was a big deal because there were about 90 years of asbestos in that mountain. And it also had something to do with locating the road from Cassiar to Watson Lake in the Northwest Territories. You all know that the PGE did an offshoot from Prince George up through Stewart Lake and Trembler and Tatler and up down into the Skeena, up to Skeena and down into Dease Lake. If you go there today, you will still see the grade. And it was abandoned for two reasons. One, in 1981, the government ran out of money, and two, asbestos became very unpopular. So Thorne was quite a guy, and in 1953, there was a big rush on the Grand Duke Glacier for staking a big copper claim on the Leduc Glacier. And Thorne went in there with a float plane to stake claims, and they had to get in there fast before someone beat them to it. And they went in with a float plane, just took a light load of surveying equipment and to get on with the job. And the plane was supposed to come back with all their food and bedding and tents and so on. Anyway, they were working, and about 3 or 4 hours later, the storm came in, lasted for 7 days. So they stayed working on the glacier for 2 days, and finally they had to pack it in. Their sleeping bags were mush, and they walked out down the glacier to some forest. Wasn't 7 days before it was 7 days before a plane came in to take them out of there. And Thorne used to say that he came close to freezing to death and starving to death on that trip. So he also did a colonist-sponsored expedition into the west coast of Vancouver Island looking for caves. And he'd found a cave in 1919, and again in 1935. And this time they couldn't find it, but they found another cave that was better. So anyway, Thorne died in 1964. He was a very interesting Cordova Bay character. And I was glad to... one of the fellows that worked for him was John Motherwell. John Motherwell is about 90 years old now. He was articled to Thorne Forrest. So I was very glad to know him. Another interesting guy was called Bob Harrison. And Bob and June lived on Barrow Street. Now Bob, he was an extraordinarily nice fellow. And his father and his 3 brothers were all squadron leaders in the RAF. And he had an accident with his eye, and he had his eye taken out. So he was a mechanic for the RAF on planes. Anyway, he was also a dirt track racer, and he was well known in England as a top racer. And they came to Canada in 1948, got a job with the Lands Department maintaining the planes for Isle of Pat Bay. And while he was doing this, he learned how to fly, and he also went back to racing at Abbotsford, and he was one of the leading racers at Abbotsford, and very well thought of. Eventually, he got settled into the plane business, and he was the guy that converted the Mars bombers into water bombers and the Canso flying boats into water bombers. Later on, when he was a bit older, he invented a fiberglass floor for kitchens and garages, and he said it was indestructible. Anyway, that was Bob Harris and his lovely wife June. I don't know if you know any of these people, but they're wonderful people at Cadova Bay. Now, another one is Pye Kirkendale. Pye Kirkendale was the president of the Cadova Bay Association, and one of those guys that worked every night up on the community hall building it, and he and my dad used to talk quite a bit, and I guess what they had in common was boats and was boats and fishing. And one day they cooked up an idea that we would all go to Darcy Island on a big picnic in August. So my dad invited 14 people. He owned a big 28-foot lifeboat, the kind that hangs on the side of the Titanic. And one day we went out to Darcy Island, and we hit the rock that's in the middle of the channel. I don't know if any of you know Darcy and Little Darcy, but there's a big reef right in the middle, and we hit it. But we didn't hit it very hard, and we slid off, and George said that he had to beach the boat and have a look, make sure there wasn't any damage. So we beached it on Darcy, and there was no appreciable damage. So we spent the day picnicking on that beach, and I was allowed to invite one of my friends, and I invited Brian Caution. You'll hear more about him later. He's from Cadova Bay. And came back, had a wonderful day. Pye Kirkendale's grandfather was the captain and harbour master for Victoria. His father was a lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Navy. He worked at the dockyard in Aden, I can't remember which, and I went to see Pye a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and he was very pleased to see me, and but I wasn't sure if he knew who I was. And anyway, last year he died. But Pye was a great guy too. I got to get along with these. Now, another person who I personally had a very good relationship with was Stuart Brock. Stuart Brock was a councillor, was Saanich councillor. He was head of the planning committee. He was head of the building committee and head of the industrial development committee. He lived on the corner of Walima and Rambler. He had a big house there on the corner with a lovely garden. He was a real gentleman, and took an interest in me. I guess he was interested. He was friends with my mom and dad because their association with St. David's, and he took it upon himself to write a great letter of recommendation for me to this job that I was trying to get up in the Yukon. I think that not many people seem to remember him. Anyway, great guy. Another fellow. Now we're getting into some of my friends. Down on Agate Lane was some people called Chuck and Iria Bowden, and their son Norman. Norman was a grade 12 student at Vic High, and Iria was a Finnish lady, a salt of the earth, and Norman and I, by then it was the fall of '53, and I was going to Vic High, and Norman was a grade 12 student, and he had a little prefect, and I was in grade 10, and we would go off in the prefect. And one day we were going to school, and a bunch of at the foot of Seaview Heights, we dropped something from the car window, and Norman made a U-turn, and without looking to see what was coming, and we got hit broadside by a coastline's bus. And it hooked into our fender, but it didn't hurt us, but it wrecked the car. And so Norman's dad, of course, was really annoyed. And the long shot of that was that Norm quit school. He was a very good student, but what he really wanted to be was a professional golfer. And I don't know if any of you remember Norm Bowden, but he had a job with the Gorgeville Golf Course as a greensman the moment the grass started to grow in March. So he got that job, and he spent the next few years polishing his golf, and he started winning tournaments on the island and on the mainland and back east in America. He eventually became the pro at Cowichan Valley, and eventually built his own golf course at Honeymoon Bay. Norm's mother and father, I'm just digress a minute, when we came to Kilova Bay, it was August 52, and in January 1955, my grandmother was dying in England. And so my father said he had to go to England for a couple of months, 3 months. So my mother wasn't very happy about that. She said, well, I'd like to go too. So they decided to sell the store. And be damned if they didn't sell it. It took only 2 or 3 weeks to sell it. And it was bought by a person called Day, who we never really got to know, but his name was Day. And so the question was, what to do with John? That's me. And so it was decided that I would stay with the Bowdens, and because my mom and dad were not intending to be back till July. And so I boarded with the Bowdens. It became my second home. Norm was my friend, of course. And I started getting the idea that I would maybe like to hitchhike back to Montreal and meet my parents and come back with them on the train. So Chuck Bowden was a very interesting guy. When he was a young man, he'd gone with the army of young men across Canada on boxcars and trains during the Depression to try and protest to the Canadian government. And they were hassled, of course, all the way across Canada, and finally at Winnipeg they were stopped. And Chuck was very much involved with that, and he didn't think very much of the CPR police, I'll tell you. And anyway, I really liked Chuck, and I told him my idea about hitchhiking, and instead of saying, no, you can't do that, he encouraged me to do it. And he gave me a form saying that I was allowed to go. So that's what I did, and I had many adventures, and I too learned how to ride on boxcars. But my mother and father got caught in a general strike in England, and I never did see my mother and father again, so I had to get back on my own. Anyway, that was in 55. Chuck and Erie, though, were very special people. Next we come to the DeBlaws that lived on the corner of Agate Lane and Kilova Bay Road in that concrete block building. There were 3 DeBlaw kids. One was Albert, Rosemary, and Jeff. Jeff was my friend. And there were 2 half-siblings, Brian and Judy McCaution. And Jeff was a very smart fellow. He was constantly in the library and reading popular mechanics, and he was an inventor, and he invented a left-handed crescent wrench. He invented some cookie dough, and the idea with the cookie dough, you'd roll it up like a sausage, and then you would cut it into little pieces, and slice, put it in the oven, and bake it, and there you go, lovely cookies. So he asked my mother if she would try to sell some of these, and she did, and they sold reasonably well, but there was no run on them. And so I had quit school also when Norm quit school, one thing, I lost my ride, and for another thing, I wasn't very intellectually challenged at that time. And so I got a job with Jeff selling those cookies door to door. And of course, what I did was I went to my old neighborhoods, Craigflower School and Tommy School. Incidentally, Royal Oak School was my 7th school. And I was able to sell quite a few of the people that knew me or knew my parents, but it was a tough sell to anyone that didn't know me. So that lasted about 2 weeks, and then my father said, "Well, I'll teach you to be a plasterer." And so I started helping my dad learning how to be a plasterer. Now, Brian McCaution, who was my friend I talked about, Darcy Island, he was a milkman at this stage, and apparently the milkmen were allowed to bring home 1 quart of cream every day. And so many afternoon I would be in the basement of the DeVos and drinking a glass of pure cream. And I used to think, I wonder if some of this cream is going in those cookies, perhaps. Anyway, that's the DeVos. And of course, Jeff is long gone, and I don't know what happened to Brian. Most of these people I have not seen at all. Now, moving along. Bernie Rogers, that built the Snow White house. He, around 1953, I used to go down there when he was building that place, and I'd hang around, and he'd say, "Well, pass this and hold that and go get that." And so I eventually got to know him, and he was very, very easy to get along with, man. He started British Importers, and he grew up on Salt Spring Island, and he was a very easy to get along with guy. And he had a daughter called Pat, and I eventually asked her for a date. They used to have a raft moored a couple of 100 feet out to sea there, and they had a fast speedboat. And it was from that raft and their speedboat that I learned how to water ski. And years later, in a professional capacity, I did some work on the Snow White house for the new owner, which I think his name was, can't remember. Anyway, so next, Mr. Tucker next door was the guy that owned the Shell gas station. He lived on Dumac Avenue, just behind the gas station. He was a very quiet and unassuming man, always smiling, very popular with the kids. And a lot of you know him from mechanics. He used to let the kids come in and use his hoist and use his tools, and he allowed me to put in a new clutch, and then 3 or 4 months later to put in a valve grind on my 1940 Plymouth. When I say when he allowed me to do it, actually he allowed Paul Elliott to do it, and I was the helper to Paul Elliott. Paul Elliott was a young fellow that went to university school, used to drive around in the 1932 Essex that his mother owned. His mother was a nurse at the Veterans Hospital. Mr. Tucker, I think everyone in Cordova Bay liked Mr. Tucker. Next, Dr. Hunt. Dr. Hunt lived in Cordova Bay, almost opposite our store, and the house was down at the water, and about 1953 or 4, he decided to build an office, and sort of a round or hexagon type office. And I believe, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was November the 11th, my dad and I started to do the petticoating inside, because it was an office, so it was all smooth, like you would have a kitchen or a bathroom in the old days. And we started to work on it in the morning, and by about lunchtime, the temperature dropped like a rock, and plaster started to freeze on the wall. So we started to do that, you see. So we rushed over, got a coal oil heater, and we were able to get the thing heated up and leave it in overnight, and we finished that job. But Dr. Hunt was our personal doctor, and he had a beautiful wife called Julia, and Julia was a violin player in the Victoria Symphony Orchestra. Wonderful family. Now, next is somebody that I didn't know terribly well, but my dad did. Stan Lloyd. He was an architect with Provincial Public Works in Victoria. And I guess what Stan Lloyd and my dad had in common is they both were English, and they both knew quite a bit about construction. So they were good friends, and at that time my father was doing all the work for John de Castries. And John de Castries at that time was a brilliant young architect. He'd done the Trend House, he'd done the Brown House at 10 Mile Point, for the Dunsmuirs, and another peculiar house up on overlooking Royal Bay in the Squamont Lagoon. And I worked on all these, and anyway, that's when I started to seriously want to become, started to learn to be a serious plasterer. And the connection with Stan Lloyd was, I'm pretty sure that Stan Lloyd was the one that recommended my dad to John de Castries. Years later, I too worked for for John de Castries in a professional capacity, and when he did the upgrade of the museum, I did the work for that and for the IMAX, and that was all de Castries' work. And let's see now. Yes, that's about covers it for de Castries. Now, in the spring of '54, in January, because of the bad weather and that, I had some time off, and my dad and a fellow called Lieutenant Christopher, that lived on the track, or I guess they call that Halliburton, decided it would be a good idea for me to join the Rainbow Sea Cadets, and to try to knock a bit of discipline into me. And so I happily went off with Lieutenant Christopher for probably January '54 to the summer of '54. I enjoyed it, I learned a lot, but I was a starting seaman, and the people in charge of me were petty officers, and I was bigger than they were, so I enjoyed my time there, but it never amounted to too much. But Christopher was a decent guy, very decent guy. I liked him very much. Now someone who I know quite well, and who I thought quite a bit of, was the Mona Wastrel. And there was Mona and Jim and Elaine. And when I first came to Kilova Bay, there were three, in the very first week, there were three girls that used to come hanging around in a group. And I was very flattered by this attention, because up to this point, not one single girl had ever given me any attention. So to have three, it really was wonderful. Anyway, those three girls were Mona, and were Glenda Netterfield and Anne Sutton. And of course, I've never seen any of them since I left Kilova Bay. At that time, the kids in Kilova Bay used to race racing boats down Seaview Heights, and we had a plank and two 2x4s on the front and back, and a bit of rope for steerage and then a couple of boards for brakes. And I remember going down there about 13 times and not having a crash up. And on I think the 13th time, Mona Wastell was my brakeman at the back. And we came down from the top, and on that corner, just before you hit the track, we didn't make it, and we piled into the dirt bank. And fortunately, Mona wasn't hurt, but I hurt my back a bit. But lots of kids were doing that, and of course you had to stop because you would come out on Clover Bay Road, so you had to stop one way or the other. I think later on, Mona, you would know more than I did about this, but Mona, I think she was certainly going steady with somebody called Jack Quinton, and I presumed that she married him, but would you know if that was so? Yeah, that's so. Okay, well there you go. So that's Mona. Now, there's one other storekeeper, and do you all remember Mr. Henderson from Royal Oak High School? And he taught us English Literature 10, and I believe that most of the boys were not serious students in English literature at that time, because there was an awful lot of fooling around in the back. But Mr. Henderson was a wonderful guy. I thought a great deal of him. Now, some of the other people who impressed me in Clover Bay, but weren't customers of our store, one was somebody who I later became good friends with and knew very well. One was Ernie McMinn, and the McMinn Park out there was named after him. Now, Ernie was quite a guy. He grew up in Port Alberni. He went to Vic College, Craigdarroch Castle, which was Vic College, normal school. And 1941, he was the editor for the yearbook, and he did such a good job that Pierre Burton wrote him a personal letter saying that up to now you've done the most professional job of your yearbook. That was 1941. He went into the army and he was with the Canadian Scottish, and he became a sergeant. He became a sergeant several times because Ernie was a very spirited guy, and he would do something wrong and they'd bust him, and then when it was time to go into battle again, they'd need someone to lead the charge, and he'd be promoted to sergeant again. So his war stories are humorous and brave, but humorous in the sense that Ernie was always the first one to try and find a wine cellar. Anyway, Ernie went on to UBC after the war. He got his Bachelor of Applied Science with an English major, and he joined the Topographic Survey Department, provincial department, and he got his British Columbia Land Surveyors Commission, and he got his Dominion Land Surveyors Commission. And in 1950, we were right in the start of the great gas and oil boom in the northeast corner. Now, the northeast corner of BC is everything east of the Alaska Highway and everything north of, say, Fort St. John. And, well, let's say everything north of the Peace River. And these were big people, big expensive oil companies that wanted to put in lease and get permits for gas and oil drilling. And they were going in there and trying to pick their sites. And the problem was it's 26,000 square miles, and they didn't know where they were. They didn't know if they got all they wanted to get, or whether they should get some more, or because most of that country is swamp or muskeg. There's a few high dry ridges, and that's where the roads are built today, but there were no roads in those days. And so the government put Bernie McMinn in charge of putting in survey control for that whole corner. So in the next 3 years, Bernie decided to do it by triangulation, because it would be impossible to do it any other way. was also very difficult to do by triangulation because there was no high hills. So they came up with the idea of building towers. And they built probably over 100 towers. The highest one was 126 feet high, which is like a 12-story building. And the way they would do this, they would try and find 3 trees together, close together, and they would lash them together and build that up. That would become the tower with the instrument, the transit on it. And then they need another tower that was built around it for the surveyor to stand on to read the angles, because you couldn't be on the both. It would affect these are very accurate angles, and if you stood on the same tower, even if you changed it 30 seconds, it would be too much. It would be useless. So they did all this work, all these towers. They had army trucks, they had pack horses, they had skidoos, they had native guides, river boats, horses, you name it, in there for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, Ernie had that whole thing under control. And my boss, who I was article to, was one of those people who worked on those towers. And he fell off one of the towers, and his arm had caught, and he was caught hanging there for a long time before they were able to cut him down. It was a very dangerous job, and it was almost a miracle they got it done. And for that, Ernie, UBC gave him his professional engineers, and he wrote his report called The Triangulation of the Northeastern British Columbia. And that's worth reading. And all over the world, the survey community know about that job. So that's McMinn. Now McMinn, I knew him very well because as I say, I used to work with him, not for him, but with him. And I'd just like to tell you one of his little tricks. In every year there'd be kids looking for a job, college kids would come down, and the secretary would say, well, put your name on the list, we'll phone you when we're ready. So about usually at the end of March, they would phone all these kids, and they would come down to the Parliament buildings, and they'd all pile into two army trucks, and they all drive out to bottom of Mount Finlayson. And Ernie would get out and he'd say, okay, you guys, we need 90 guys this year, 30 are coming back, so we need 52. So what we'll do is when you get to the top, there'll be a couple of guys, go and give them your name. So he said, the first 52 guys up to the top get the job. Now, McMinn was so practical that, because you see, what these kids were doing is they were packing 6-volt batteries up 8,000-foot mountains through the bush, and chopping line, and so naturally that was the most, if you could get up there without hurting yourself, then you're the guy that we want, So anyway, that's a little something about McMinn, and he's very highly thought of, and not in Killaloe Bay, but everywhere. And so I thought you should know about it. I'll try and get through. I don't know if I'll try and get through just a few more. Where are we? Now, George McMurran. I didn't have a whole lot to do with George McMurran, but at Christmas in 1953, I was hanging around down at the coffee shop at the Gorge, and I noticed that they had a lot of unsold Christmas trees. So we didn't have one, and my parents were so damn busy that they didn't know whether they were extremely busy. And so I thought, well, I'll get one. So I asked George, can I have a tree? Expecting to get a deal. And to my astonishment, he said, yeah. He said, take your pick on the house. So that was I thought at the time that was a generous thing to do. Now, Eric, we knew Eric a lot better because I used to work for the Department of Lands, and we had a lot of dances at the Crystal Garden and at McMorran's, and so some of those lands dances were fairly lively affairs. Eric had to be on his toes to keep keep things under control. And so I got to know Eric very well, and his lovely wife that used to take the tickets. One time, my wife's father was down from Fort St. James, and Sandra whispered into his ear. She said, "Eric, my dad's here from Fort St. James." So nothing more than that. And so within a few minutes, Eric was up on his feet at the microphone saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome Dunninghoff from Fort St. James. He's down here," and so it meant the world to Dunning because, you know, he was a guy from the north and wasn't used to all the fancy trappings that we have in these city folks, you know. And I respected Eric greatly, and especially at the end when he was out there directing traffic and he was about 90 years old. He was a wonderful old guy. I don't think I did Bill Maddock. One interesting story about Bill Maddock, they were one of our best customers. And of course, Bill had a daughter called Anne, and I don't know what happened to her. I haven't seen her ever. And my job was to take a case of Canada Dry, the big wooden cases, up to Maddox every Friday night. And I'd heard that they had a poker game there every Friday night. And so I used to think, well, gosh, they drink an awful lot of Canada Dry. But some of the kids worked for him on the farm, and that I never did. I don't know whether they had the plans to expand, but at those days they just had a little tiny vegetable stand there, and they were extremely good customers for us. McMorran's, they hadn't started their shopping centre yet, and I suppose they had that in the back of their mind, but there was no talk of it that I know. And just quickly, the last few here, then there was the Adrians that ran a coffee shop at the corner of Fenn Road and Clover Bay Road. Jack was a kid that was in a younger grade to me, didn't know him very well, but the father was might have been a sergeant, but anyway, he was a Saanich policeman, and he was a decent guy. He knew all the Clover Bay kids, and he knew what the characters were, and it's good to have somebody like that. That coffee shop and McMorran's were the only two places you could go on a wintry, rainy day in Clover Bay. Joe Andrews. Now I don't know if any of you know Joe Andrews. He lived on Halliburton. He was my Science 10 teacher at Vic High. Joe Andrews was another great teacher. I mentioned him because he lived at Clover Bay, and I did have an association with him. Bill Oldham. Now, Bill Oldham was an interesting guy. I rode on the school bus with him, and he was in grade 11, I think, and I was in grade 9. Didn't see him again till 1981. 1981, I took a 3-year course in planning at UBC, and part of the course was the engineering aspect. And be damned if the person who took the engineering was Professor Bill Oldham. And I thought, holy God, imagine that, a professor of engineering. So he did very, very well. I don't know how many of you know him or see, but amazing guy, just amazing. I almost finished. Wilkerson's, here's another interesting side story. There used to be a people called Wilkerson's that had a property, summer house, and it was on the beach, and it fronted on Clover Bay Road as well, and Agate Lane. And there used to be a kid that my age that came over from Vancouver, and he came over to stay a couple of weeks with his grandparents in the summer. And he and I got along well, and later on he wrote he wrote for one of the Vancouver papers, and he became quite famous. And anyway, about 6 o'clock one night in the summer, we asked Mr. Wilkerson if we could borrow his rowboat. And he said, sure. So he and I rowed full speed as fast as we could go to San Juan Island. And about 8:30 at night, we were still going. And the wind was starting to come up a bit, and the sun was starting to go down, and the current was starting to swirl a little bit. So we figured, well, maybe we better turn around. So we turned around and started rowing back. Darkness came, and we could see all the lights, of course, at Killaloe Bay. We weren't that bad. And we kept rowing. Finally got back to Killaloe Bay at 10:30. They had a fire on the beach for us. And Mr. Wilkerson and my dad were there to meet us, and there was serious trouble to pay for that little. And I don't think Mr. Wilkerson ever forgave us. Another story about the Lindvalls. We all know about the Lindvalls. They were like pillars of the Killaloe Bay. You probably know all about them. There was Roger, Virginia, and Victor. But coming back on the school bus, Roger decided to let off an ammonium sulfide bomb, stink bomb on the bus. And I think Vic got into the trouble on that too. But Vic was, Vic was tremendous amount of energy, very strong, very, very strong character. And I saw him about maybe 10 years ago. He was riding his bicycle, and he came up beside me, and we rode together. And I think he's in some kind of enlightenment. Like he to give you some enlightenment if you need it. But I didn't figure I needed it, so. And so anyway, I guess all I wanted to say is that these are observations based on a kid that was 14 to 17 years old, and didn't know nothing, and that's the truth. I had to go to St. Louis College and graduate from St. Louis before I started to learn something. So anyway, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. Can anyone tell me what happened to Ian, Ross, and David Genn? There's a picture of them up there. They were my friends, and I haven't seen them. Does anyone know what happened to them?
David Genn is up in Souk, and he's done some work on our blog, like getting names all in order.
Yeah.
He lost his brother John a couple of years ago, but he lives way up in Souk.
Well, is David the one that's the artist?
No, that's a relative of his, though.
Oh, I see. But, by the way, it's a pretty lively group. I'm surprised that it's so engaged. I think I really do think you're a very lively group, and I think you've got a good future.